Nick Clegg, thanks so much for joining us today. In the interest of full disclosure, Nick and I did serve together on the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity until he resigned upon taking his position at Facebook. Thanks a lot, Nick, for joining us here today.
It's great to be with you.
Facebook is a behemoth. 70% of Americans log on regularly to the platform. So I want to talk today about Facebook's obligation to provide accurate and factual information and what the implications are for American democracy. So let me start here. Who is responsible for the accuracy of the information on Facebook?
We all have a sort of shared responsibility. The people who post the content, of course, social media is very different to traditional publications in the sense that you'll be relieved to hear Mark Zuckerberg's not like a newspaper editor. He doesn't say, this goes on page 4 and we're going to do that investigation, that subject. That's the great emancipating, if disruptive thing about social media. It's people using new technologies for free because they're paid for by advertising to express themselves on a scale never seen before. And that candidly brings to the surface the good, the bad, and the ugly of what people want to say. And so I think we all have a responsibility, primarily, of course, people who are posting content. But what we can do at Facebook is obviously remove and block things that would lead to direct harm. But in terms of trying to connect people, particularly at election time, to useful information so they get reliable, authoritative information about what's going on in an election campaign, we can create resources. We did that in the US elections last year. We created a voter information center and directed 140 million people to it, 33 million people, would you believe it, on election day alone. And that also helped, I think, over 4.5 million Americans register to vote who otherwise wouldn't have registered to vote. So we can do that. We can work hand in glove with fact checkers. We've got about 80 fact checkers in, I think, over 60 languages around the world. And they can independently label things as missing context or false or partly false. But here's the big but, Gene. At the end of the day, the right to talk gibberish, to the right to sort of, talk nonsense is a fundamental right in a free society. I don't think anyone would want a Silicon Valley company to be an absolute truth police and only to allow people to say whatever pops into their brain and express it on social media if it's first been vetted for absolute factual accuracy. So that's not the territory I think anybody, should, in my view, want Facebook to go in. But we can do a lot besides that. We can block stuff that's harmful. We can point people to authoritative information. We can fact check and use independent fact checkers so people can have available to them independent verification of stuff that's being posted. But it's a difficult balance to strike, for which we all have a responsibility.
As you well know, Nick, vaccine disinformation is running rampant all across the internet. And there have been some who have suggested that Section 230, which has shielded platforms like yourself from any liability for posting inaccurate and wild content, should be reformed in some way. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think it should be reformed. It's 25 years old. It's not surprising that it's starting to sort of show its age.
So what should the new Section 230 look like?
Well, in our view at Facebook, what would make sense would be a reform of Section 230, which in effect says the following: says to big platforms like YouTube and TikTok and Twitter and Facebook, look, you guys have got to show us, in other words, us, the American people, through their legislators and through perhaps a dedicated regulator that would need to be established for this purpose. You've got to show us that you've got proper systems to coherently monitor what's on your platform, to act in pursuit of the standards which you have, setting out what is and what is not allowed on your platform. You've got to do that transparently and accountably. And if you don't do that properly, then the immunity or the immunity from liability, the content liability that you enjoy under Section 230 could be taken away from you. In other words, to make that immunity from content liability conditional on having the standards, the processes and systems in place to properly moderate content on our platforms. I think that would strike the right balance between putting the responsibility on the platforms to have the systems in place without getting into what I think would be very, very perilous territory, which is having legislators sort of line by line deciding what kind of adjective, adverb and content they individually like. No one wants that.
So that's a long-term strategy. But in the short term, President Biden has said that Facebook is killing people because of vaccine disinformation. What are you going to do?
Well, to be fair to President Biden, I think he sort of said that he wasn't saying, he clarified his remarks
He
and
stepped
said
back.
that,
It's true. Yes.
well, sure. But I've had, subsequent meetings with members of the administration. We have ongoing meetings with the administration, as we do with governments around the world, to explain what we do to ensure that people who use our services have access to authoritative information about COVID. We have a COVID information center, which over 2 billion people around the world have used. And it's not as if there's a sort of inactivity. Facebook alone has removed, I think, around 86 million pieces of COVID misinformation,
But
which we judge would be damaging.
How big a universe of misinformation is it?
Well, you can measure the outcome. So what we measure, and we have surveys which we do with universities like the Carnegie Mellon University. It's the largest survey of its kind anywhere in the world. Millions of people have replied, explaining what they think about COVID information online and so on. And we've seen that since January, there's been a 15% decline in vaccine hesitancy amongst the millions of Americans who use Facebook. And it now around 85% of American Facebook users actually accept and believe in vaccines. So we're seeing actually measurable steps in the right direction. We have labeled around 167 million pieces of COVID content because we think, or our fact checkers rather, think that they are inaccurate. So we can always try and do more. We must always try and do more. We cannot eliminate people's right in a free society to express reservations about how the pandemic has been conducted, not least, by the way, because scientific consensus changes. You'll remember, for instance, Facebook used to remove claims that COVID was human-made. Then the scientific consensus shifted and said, well, maybe it is. And then if we had to shift with that. So, it isn't a static line, and we constantly consult with experts and scientists to try and draw the line in the right place.
So a couple of points. One, I don't think it's possible to draw a clear connection between what people are reading on Facebook and their vaccine hesitancy. But beyond that, there are critics who say that you're doing this in a very piecemeal fashion, that you still haven't found a systematic way to stop disinformation, whether it's about vaccines or politics or something else.
Well, I accept, Jean, this will always be a contested place, because one person's offensive speech or speech which they think shouldn't be allowed is another person's right to free expression. And we are an American company based and rooted in American values, rooted in the First Amendment tradition in the United States, which doesn't believe that there is, everything goes. It's not a free-for-all. So we do remove, which is our ultimate sanction, millions and millions of pieces of content, which we think would lead to direct real-world harm. But we also want to give people real latitude to express their opinions, even if those opinions are not always completely accurate, or even if they might cause offense to others. We cannot cleanse the internet, and I think no one would want us to pasteurize the content, because I'll tell you why, not least in the United States, there is such a vigorous and polarized debate about what speech is and is not allowed. And we are trying to represent, or we're trying to serve the whole country. And at the moment in the United States, as you know, we have the left saying that we don't take down enough content and the right saying we take down too much. I don't believe the right and the left are ever going to agree on this. In the meantime, we try and do the right thing, and we try and be as transparent and consistent in the rules that we apply and the rules that we set out very openly for everybody to be able to look at and examine themselves.
So you did deplatform your oversight board, deplatformed the former president, Donald Trump. Did you go too far?
Well, we acted in accordance with what an independent body told us was in our rights to do. And the oversight board, which is the first of its kind, no other tech companies established. This is an independent panel of highly authoritative people from around the world, from the right, from the left, from all wings of the political spectrum. They looked at it and they said the gravity of what happened at the time of the insurrection on the Capitol on January the 6th, and the content that the then President Trump issued in a way which clearly they felt incited people who were involved in the violence and the disruption on that day. They felt that was of such a great gravity that we were in our rights to say that he no longer had the right to post content on Facebook. But I should be clear, other platforms have removed him permanently. We have said, no, we're not imposing a permanent ban. We're imposing what we think is a proportionate time-bound suspension of 2 years, and we believe that is in line with the guidance that were given by this independent oversight board.
So I'm curious as to what effect it's had. Have you seen a reduction in the flow of political disinformation since he's been deplatformed, or have you seen a decline in the number of Facebook users?
I think what we've generally seen, because we're no longer in the throes of an immediate electoral cycle, is the sort of sheer intensity of the heat and fury that you saw up to the election in November last year, and then of course continuing right through the elections in some of the particular states, and then of course the events in early January. I think there's been a reduction in the temperature generally. If you look at readership of newspapers, for instance, they've in some cases they've plummeted because political sort of interest has waned. I tell you what, we have heard,
because he's deplatformed.
Well, I think it may be. I think it's partly also to do with, and I certainly remember this in my own 20 years in politics. Politics goes in cycles, and there will be another peak, no doubt, at the midterm elections next year. I'll tell you what we have heard, Jean. I can share this with you. We did get very, very clear and loud feedback from users, and not just in the US, interestingly, but around the world, during particularly the latter months of last year, and it's been continuing since then, that many, many Facebook users don't like to have that much political content in their newsfeed. Now, one of the things that is often misunderstood is there's an assumption, particularly amongst, dare I say it, the sort of coastal elites that talk and write about politics in the United States, that social media is completely full, brimming to the full with political content. In fact, political and so-called civic content only constitutes about 6% of the total content on Facebook. Most of the content on Facebook is, babies, bar mitzvahs, barbecues. It's everyday, innocent, playful stuff. It's small businesses trying to make a living. And what we've definitely heard from many of our users is that that's why they cherish social media, not for people to start shouting to each other about politics. And that's a clear signal we've heard from users. And we're clearly now considering how we should be responsive to that message from our users.
So I'm curious about a couple of things. There are people who study the issue of disinformation who say that Facebook itself hasn't studied it closely enough, that you don't understand yet exactly how it is that it spreads so far and so fast. Valid criticism?
I think valid in the sense that more research can always be done. Invalid criticism in the sense that if it suggests that somehow we're not being active on this front, I think that is actually, any reasonable person would say it's unfair. For instance, we have entered into Facebook an unprecedented cooperation with more than a dozen researchers looking into how Facebook was used by voters in the run-up to the US elections. We've provided them with unprecedented data sets that have never been shared with researchers before. They've recently clarified that they hope to be publishing the fruits of their research independently of Facebook from, I think, in the first half of next year. So, of course, there's more to learn. There's always more research to be done. In fact, quite a lot of the independent research that's been done about the relationship, for instance, between social media and polarization, actually, if anything, shows quite different conclusions to what you might think. Stanford, for instance, last year looked in depth at trends in 9 countries over 40 years and found that in many countries, polarization was either on the rise before Facebook even existed, and in others it's been decreasing while the use of Facebook has been increasing. So the idea that there is always a causal link between social media and polarization is not true. And in fact, some other studies, credible studies, have shown that in the United States, polarization has increased the most amongst the demographic groups that are least likely to use the internet.
You say you shared data. Some researchers say you haven't shared enough. They want to know more about your algorithms and how this whole ecosystem of social media works. Will you open more information up for an independent audit that will explore how you work?
Well, as I say, we've gone further than that already. So we've already committed to providing unprecedented data sets to independent researchers. Well, of course, everybody always wants more, and we will always seek to do more. We've already said that, for instance, in terms of how newsfeed is algorithmically ranked, But not, by the way, not only that we'll explain more about the signals that we use, and there are multiple signals from the device that you're using, from the time of day, from the kind of stuff that you've shared with your friends and the groups you're members of. We will provide more and more of that information, but we'll go even further than that, Gene. And we've recently given users the ability to, in effect, override the algorithm altogether. Literally say, I don't want Facebook to algorithmically rank what I see first, second, third, fourth, fifth on my newsfeed. I want to in effect curate it myself. And that's a new thing that we've
mentioned. Some people are perfectly happy within their bubble. Polarization,
well,
you claim, independent of Facebook.
Yes, but again, the research, and again, this is what independent researchers, since you quite rightly laid such emphasis on them, have shown that, oddly enough, because most people on Facebook have a range of friends who, stretch from childhood friends to, work colleagues to people they've played sports with, you tend to have a more heterogeneous and mixed ideological composition of your friends on Facebook than you do if you read the same partisan newspaper or watch the same cable TV news outlet. So social media is not as narrow in terms of its ideological diet. This is what independent researchers have proven than is often asserted.
Nick, some people say you're really not interested in ending the controversy and the very inflammatory content because it makes you money. So what's the greater interest for Facebook? Is it money or is it democracy?
So I flatly and vigorously reject this idea that Facebook has an incentive to spoon feed people sort of addictive, extreme, violent, unpleasant, hateful content. Why on earth would we want to do that? If we were to do that, people would not continue to use Facebook in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 15 years' time. We know from our own research that if you want people to use Facebook for the long term, which we have a business interest in doing, we're not interested in having someone addicted to using Facebook for 20 extra minutes. We want this social media experience to be a wholesome, meaningful one for the next 20 years. And that's why we take down as much hateful speech. And just to prove the case, we have recently published a verifiable data which shows that the prevalence of hate speech is now as low as 0.05%. That means, Gene, that for every 10,000 bits of content, you might see 5 bits of hate speech. I wish it was 0. Unfortunately, there are always human beings who want to issue this bile and this hateful speech. We catch the vast majority of it before anyone reports it to us. I don't think we're going to change human nature, but the idea that we have an incentive to prioritize this is, I think, one of the most misleading allegations of the numerous critics that social media has these days.
And Nick Clegg, we have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.